I'm going to analyze the opening scene from the HBO Max television series, The Last of Us. The Last of Us centers on a fictional fungal pandemic that basically is a civilizational existential risk. And what I'm going to do is try and explain what the role of fungi are in pandemic, where the show at least hypothesizes correctly, where it's fictional, and see what that means in general for pandemic preparedness. So let's watch.
And that's your biggest worry?
Yes, any kind of virus, but most probably something similar to influenza.
Because of air travel?
Through the air. Coughing.
I'm sorry, I meant people on planes. That was something you described in your book.
Yes, a new virus in Madagascar, say, could be in Chicago within a matter of weeks, and we end up with a global pandemic. Pan meaning all, the whole world becomes sick all at once.
So you see 1968 discussed there. So 1968 was an influenza pandemic. Pan means all, demos means people, all the people. And they're referring to air travel. And that played a major role in the ability of viruses to spread rapidly from one corner of the world to the other. And we've all seen that with flu, and we've seen that with COVID, certainly. And that is something that I think remains true, that when it comes to pandemics, in my mind and in my analysis, the exclusive province of pandemics in 2026 are respiratory viruses, because they spread so efficiently from person to person. Often they have a spectrum of illness, with those with very mild or no symptoms at all being contagious. And that's why I've always ranked influenza viruses at the highest level when it comes to pandemic threat. And certainly the 1968 H3N2 influenza A pandemic was one of many pandemics that influenza has caused.
And Dr. Newman, you're also an epidemiologist. I presume the prospect of a viral pandemic keeps you up at night as well?
No.
No?
No.
All right, well, that's our show.
No, mankind has been at war with the virus from the start. Sometimes millions of people die, as in an actual war, but in the end, we always win.
But you, just to be clear, you do think microorganisms pose a threat?
Or in the most dire terms.
Bacteria?
No.
So now you have Professor Newton speaking, and he says that a viral pandemic doesn't keep him up at night, even though millions of people might die. And this is something that I think is true, that when it comes to civilizational risk, it's very hard for any type of infectious organism, in my analysis, to be an existential risk. Why? Because humans have such versatile immune systems that evolved to deal with just that threat. That even when there may be something that is cataclysmic in terms of case fatality ratio, there's always going to be some proportion of the population that, number one, doesn't get infected, number two, has some genetic variation that allows them to experience mild illness or maybe be less likely to become infected. So it will not necessarily completely destroy the human civilization. It can disrupt it. It can cause a lot of death, but I don't think that any kind of pandemic from an infectious organism is going to have that civilizational risk. And I've written about this on my Substack. Back in 2016, I published something in The Atlantic talking about this whole existential risk with pandemics. You then see the questioner ask about bacteria, and he says, no, I don't think in the modern era with antibiotics that bacteria have the capacity to cause a pandemic. Yes, they can cause very disruptive, destructive outbreaks like plague or cholera. And certainly in the Middle Ages or the late Middle Ages, the Black Death did basically kill 1/3 of Europe's population. So they had that ability, but we have antibiotics. They don't double, and their doubling time is not as quick as viruses. So they don't have all of those advantages. And even with the threat of antimicrobial resistance, which I do think is a major, major public health threat, there's still ways to craft antibiotics that work. And some of those most dangerous drug-resistant antibiotics, they don't infect the general population on the whole. They thrive in nursing homes and hospitals. So they don't have that level of existential threat or even pandemic threat that respiratory viruses do. Not that respiratory viruses have an existential threat.
You like saying no?
Yes.
Not bacteria, not viruses, so...
Fungus. Yes, that's the usual response. Fungi seem harmless enough. Many species know otherwise, because there are some fungi who seek not to kill, but to control. Let me ask you, where do we get LSD from?
Where do you get it from?
It comes from ergot, a fungus. Psilocybin, Also a fungus. Viruses can make us ill, but fungi can alter our very minds. There's a fungus that infects insects, gets inside an ant, for example, travels through its circulatory system to the ant's brain and then floods it with hallucinogens, thus bending the ant's mind to its will. The fungus starts to direct the ant's behavior, telling it where to go, what to do, like a puppeteer with a marionette. And it gets worse. The fungus needs food to live, so it begins to devour its host from within, replacing the ant's flesh with its own. But it doesn't let its victim die, no. It keeps its puppet alive by preventing decomposition. How? Where do we get penicillin from?
Fungus.
What you're seeing now is this expert center in on fungi as a threat that he really worries about. One of the statements he makes is that humans think fungi are harmless. Fungi are mushrooms, we eat them. And fungi make drugs like penicillin. The point he's making is that other species know fungi differently, and that's definitely true. So if you think about chytrid disease in frogs, if you think of diseases in salamanders and snakes and in reptiles, and even white nose syndrome in bats, those are fungal infections that really are existential threats for those species. But we don't have human existential threats from fungi, or we have not yet. I'll talk about that in a second, what the constraints are. But those types of diseases in other animal species are definitely at the level of pandemic or civilizational risk for those species that are susceptible to them. He's also alluding to the fact that in certain situations, fungi can produce psychoactive compounds like LSD, like psilocybin, and that there are certain fungal infections that can alter the behavior of the species they infect. They alter the behavior in order to propagate themselves. And I think that's a really fascinating topic. And it's not just fungi that do that. We know that certain parasites do that as well, like toxoplasmosis and what happens with rodents that are infected with toxoplasmosis. But that's where he's going with this kind of this speculation.
Dr. Schoenheiss, you're in distress.
Fungal infection of this kind is real, but not in humans.
True, fungi cannot survive if its host's internal temperature is over 94 degrees.
He's getting some pushback from the other expert about the fact that, yes, this happens in other species, but not in humans. Why? Because humans have a body temperature of around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37.5 degrees centigrade. And that temperature is not conducive to most fungi being able to flourish. In fact, some people talk about a hypothesis that there's this mammalian filter, that humans and mammals evolved temperature at that level in order to avoid fungi. Because to maintain that temperature, we have to do a lot of stuff. We have to eat a lot to keep that temperature at 98.6 degrees. So why would mammals evolve that? And it may be that was a selective advantage in order to avoid fungi that were the scourge of many other species. There are some fungi that have the ability to operate at higher temperatures, including Candida auris, which I've talked about. But that's been the major roadblock on fungi being major mammalian pathogens. And you might say, you just mentioned white nose disease in bats. So they get infected when they hibernate or when they're sleeping and their body temperature falls, which allows that fungi to be able to flourish at that temperature. So that's sort of the exception that actually proves the rule. And yes, humans do get fungal infections. They're often in individuals who are immunocompromised, who are debilitated, have an increased susceptibility to them, at least the more invasive types. You can get, obviously, athlete's foot is a fungal infection, or jock itch is a fungal infection. Those things, and yeast infections, vaginal yeast infections are also fungal infections. But these are usually minor types of things. But the invasive ones, immunocompromised individuals, critically ill people, those are the ones that they get those infections, and they don't transmit. Fungi don't transmit from person to person. Yes, athlete's foot can transmit from person to person, but in general, they don't transmit in the manner of a respiratory virus or even a bacterial pathogen.
And currently, there are no reasons for fungi to evolve to be able to withstand higher temperatures. But what if that were to change? What if, for instance, the world were to get slightly warmer? Well, now, there is reason to evolve. One gene mutates, and an Ascomycetia, Candida, ergot, Cordyceps, Aspergillus, any one of them could become capable of burrowing into our brains and taking control, not of millions of us, but billions of us.
What he's now referring to is Could there be a selective Darwinian evolutionary pressure on fungi to evolve the ability to proliferate, to be viable at higher temperature? And that's what people keep talking about as temperature ranges fluctuate on the Earth. Right now, we've seen at least one fungi, and I mentioned it earlier, Candida auris, and he mentioned Candida there in that list of fungi that he was talking about. Candida auris, that seems to have emerged on multiple different continents around the same time, was first identified in, I think, 2006. And it is one that can proliferate at higher body temperatures. Right now, Candida auris, its major threat is that it's often antifungal drug resistant. There are antifungals that work, but it's more challenging to treat. It's really a scourge of nursing homes. It's a scourge of hospitals, but it's not infecting people in the general public. It's infecting those debilitated, immunocompromised people with multiple medical conditions. And yes, the attributable mortality of Candida auris is high, but it's not something that people are often dying of. They're dying with because they have many other medical conditions that make them unable to kind of resist that fungal infection. And this is something that can be very difficult to eradicate from a nursing home, and it can be on the medical equipment, and it can spread from contact from person to person on skin. That's the one good example that we have of this hypothesis, that temperature might serve as a selective pressure on fungi. And I think that's one to keep in mind. He also mentions other fungi like Aspergillus, which is very common in the environment. This is something which causes invasive disease in the immunocompromised, people who are on chemotherapy, people who have a transplant, people who have lung disease. That's where we see it cause most of its invasive forms of disease. And he mentions one called cordyceps, which will become very important in the rest of the series.
Billions of puppets with poisoned minds, permanently fixed on one unifying goal: to spread the infection to every last human alive by any means necessary. And there are no treatments for this, no preventatives, no cures. They don't exist. It's not even possible to make them.
This is a bit of embellishment. Yes, it's challenging to make antifungal medications. Why? Because fungi are eukaryotes. So if you remember the domains of life, you've got 3 domains of life: the archaea, the prokaryotes, which include bacteria, and the eukaryotes, which include everything else. And humans and fungi are both eukaryotic cells. So a eukaryote means that it has kind of a separated nucleus, but in all intents and purposes, that means when you're targeting drugs to interfere with the metabolism of a microorganism, you have to make sure that you're not picking off the host's machinery. But because fungi and humans are both eukaryotes, it's harder to find things that are unique to fungi that we don't have. So a lot of our drugs are harder to develop. They can be toxic. Drugs like amphotericin B can be very, very toxic, but are effective against treatment of fungal diseases. We also have other classes of drugs called the azoles and the echinocandins, and there are some other drugs, antifungal drugs, that are in development that are coming through the development pipeline. So it's not exactly impossible to develop drugs against fungi. They do exist.
So if that happens,
We lose.
we'll be back.
So he says we lose, and that's what that show is about. And I'm not going to give away any spoilers, but you'll see how the human immune system works against that or doesn't work against that. The fungi that's in this TV series is called cordyceps, which is a real fungi. And the behavior that he's talking about, altering the mind or the brain function, the neurologic function of the organisms it infects, does occur, not in humans, but in ants. That ants that are infected with this will basically become zombies with the purpose of spreading those fungal spores. And that's what kind of is the premise of this TV series. And again, that's something that's very fascinating. It's something that really is an elegant biological relationship, that the fungi can create behavioral changes in the ants that are infected in order to propagate the spores of the fungi. And I think that's a scary prospect, and it probably underlies a lot of these zombie apocalypse type of scenarios that you might see on television or in movies or in novels. But I don't necessarily think it's true. As I said, there are certain parasitic diseases like toxoplasmosis that make, for example, rodents change their behavior when they're infected, so they're more easy to be captured by cats, where that parasite needs to complete its life cycle. And there's some hypotheses that maybe some of this happens with humans, but not to the degree that you're talking about in this type of movie. And certainly, rabies is a virus that changes people's behavior. They become hydrophobic, afraid of water. They hypersalivate. And in other mammals like dogs, they can become enraged and want to bite because the virus needs to spread through saliva and break skin in another organism. So those cases do exist, but we've not come to the point of what happens in this scenario in Last of Us. It is important, though, that we think through these issues about fungal infections. They are underappreciated. We do have less treatments for them, and there are environmental pressures that might cause them to evolve to become more dangerous to humans. But right now, it is a constrained type of ability to infect humans, and the pandemic threat really arises from respiratory viruses like influenza. So I hope that was interesting, and I hope you enjoyed the show. If you haven't watched it, or if you have watched it, you gained some insight into a little bit of the background behind it.